I came in 1980 as an intern to just do internal medicine at the University of Arizona. And in fact, I said to my sweetheart, I said, I know it's a desert. I know it's hot. Don't worry, we'll only be there for 3 years. 32 years later, I'm still paying for that, but it is a great place to be. I don't need to point out the beauty of this background. I do when I go around other places, particularly even outside of this country. But this is a unique environment. I'm assuming you've grown to love it as I have. This is a wonderful place to be. It's a wonderful place to practice. And something really wonderful has happened here in the last 20 years. Thank you. And that's the story I'd like to tell you. It's a story that is near and dear to my heart. It's a story that I hope you will feel some connection to because you are connected to it, whether you knew that yet tonight or not. Here's our country. No matter where you live within this boundary, cardiac arrest remains a major public health problem. The issue is, depending on where you live, will very much depend on how you'll do if you ever have to meet that ugly event. Look at the difference. This is from data just this last few years from what's called the ROC, or the Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium. You should know that you and I are paying millions of dollars for that group to study in a prospective randomized way out of hospital cardiac arrest. They're the first to get an NIH-sponsored large study continuum, and the first thing they found was even among these centers that are in the group that are expert, or they wouldn't have been invited in, you can see that the survival for overall cardiac arrest is dramatically different. As high as 16% in Seattle, which has always led this country, but as low as 3% in some other communities. Indeed, it's not only true in real estate. If you're to survive a cardiac arrest, it very much depends on location, location, and location. Well, how about our own location? Tucson City Fathers 22 years ago mandated that the fire department take this on as part of their duties. That wasn't real popular for firefighters in the beginning. They considered themselves firefighters and not paramedics, not healthcare providers. But pretty soon they caught the vision, and then, bless their hearts, the city council said, oh, and by the way, you have to keep records of outcome. Well ahead of their time. Today it's commonplace for communities to be mandated. How well are you doing? Show me how many people are alive today that would have been dead yesterday, except for what you provide. But we've had that data now over 20 years, and it's really interesting. I only have the decade of the 90s here. But notice that for all rhythms in cardiac arrest, survival to discharge never really varies much and averages 6% in Tucson as of 2002. And the best rhythm, that of shockable ventricular fibrillation, again, varies slightly at times, but never consistently getting better, averages 10%. And that's in 1992, in 96, in 2000, new guidelines were published by the American Heart Association. We all get excited, we all try again, but it didn't seem to make any difference in our community over that decade. Well, it was about just after that, in 2003, that the firefighter leadership, the actual captains of the battalions here, came to the Sarver Center with simply one request. They said, you know, we've been doing this now for 2 decades, or nearly, and we're not seeing any improvement no matter how many times the American Heart changes their rules or guidelines or standards, whatever you want to call them. Don't you have any better ideas? Because what we're doing now isn't working in this community, at least. And it's interesting, because right at that point, we did have some ideas. This is a bumper sticker I got from the local American Heart office on Pima, and I believe it to be true. But the real question we've been struggling with for decades, Gordon Avey and I over at the university, is couldn't we do better? Couldn't we save more lives if we just did something slightly different? And we had 3 ideas for those firefighter captains that day. First was compression-only CPR, or BLS, if you will. Second was a new approach for the professional rescuers, the EMS providers. And actually, they pushed us to the third one. We had an idea, but we really weren't ready to start, except when we went to teach the firefighters the first 2. They have a training facility down by the Wilmot Prison Complex, just across the street. We went down a whole summer in 2003, and we met with them 50 at a time during their education day. We gave them a simple 1-hour lecture of why we wanted to change a few things. In the beginning, they were all sitting there like this, pretty unconvinced. By the end, truthfully, every one of them, in at least every group, said, you know, we're convinced, can we start tomorrow? And we had to say, no, let's get everybody on board, everybody trained, and then we'll start. But the zinger was almost without fail. Every class would then say, you know, Doc, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, just like you ask. But what are you going to do differently when we bring more people to the hospital with a pulse and a blood pressure having been resuscitated in the field? And that's really where the final step, post-resuscitation care, arose. We've been pioneers in this community as well in that regard. And today, I don't have that with me because it's a whole nother hour. But you should know that within our community now are about 6 resuscitation centers where the survival rate is nearly 50% for ventricular fibrillation, out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And one of the great frontiers is if they do get to the hospital with a pulse and a blood pressure, if you cool them and cath them and open up their vessel that caused their cardiac arrest to start with, they actually do very well even when they arrived comatose. The old idea that just put them in the corner and let's see how they do, but let's start talking to the family because they won't do well, is no longer true, particularly in our community. Well, let's go step by step. So the first real pillar of cerebral resuscitation is chest compression only CPR for bystanders. Now, how do you get there? You get there because, in fact, in the 80s, the incidence of bystander willingness to do CPR fell exponentially. Any ideas why? AIDS. Ever been a case of AIDS reported, successfully transmitted by mouth-to-mouth resuscitation? No. But is it a zero risk? No. My father-in-law is a nuclear physicist from Berkeley. I can't hardly talk to him. He's just too smart. And he took me aside one day and he said, well, what if that fella had a cut in his mouth and I had a cut in my mouth? Couldn't it happen? The risk is about 1 in a million. Literally, if you take HIV virus and put it in a petri dish and add saliva, it's a retardant for growth. But it's not impossible. And the lay public, for whatever reason, have absolutely pinpointed that. And indeed, there's other reasons. It's very unaesthetic. Anybody actually done CPR outside the hospital? Yes, so have I. I've been in this field for 30 years. I walk around looking for a chance. Unfortunately, one time on the golf course over in Silverbell, I had it. We were playing golf. These nice older gentlemen were slowing us down all day. Every time we got to tee box, we had to wait. And all of a sudden, on the 13th hole, it goes uphill a little bit. I couldn't see them. They were out of the way. So I hit up, got on the green, and now I understood. One guy was on his back on the green, one guy was pushing on his chest, and one guy was sicker than the man who was in cardiac arrest because he was trying to do the breathing. And every time the man pushed on his chest, he gorked up more vomit. This poor guy trying to breathe for him was as sick as the man who was in arrest. Not being stupid, when I walked up, I said, you look tired pushing there. Let me take over. He said, no, I'm fine. Help him. You'll never forget it. I felt like I had to try, but it was a terrible experience, as you can imagine. It's not just us, but frankly, it is us too. There have been surveys done anonymously for lay people. How many would do mouth to mouth? And about 80% say they prefer not to. But you ask doctors, how many will say they'll do it? Yeah, and they're lying. You ask nurses, they're a little more honest, only about 5% say they'll do it. But doctors are notorious for, well, yeah, you probably won't when it comes right down to it. I'm not sure I would again after my experience. But what pushed us really was not only the incidence of bystander involvement falling, but then we began to think, well, what really counts in the early minutes of cardiac arrest? What do you need? You need to circulate your blood to deliver oxygen molecules. But in fact, if you are an adult and have a witnessed arrest, and this is very different than a child pulled from a pool. We'll go over that for a sec. If you're in this audience and you suddenly fall out of your chair and you're in VF, how much oxygen do you have in your arterial bed? A lot. How much do you have in your lung? A fair amount. So what's the real secret? It is taking the oxygen molecules you already have and getting them to your brain and your heart so you can survive that event, be defibrillated, and then resume your own circulation. If you're a young child or one of us who suddenly goes like this, turns blue, and then collapses, what's happened? They've lost their airway. What happens to your cardiac output when you start choking? Your heart rate goes to about 150. You're panicked. You use every molecule of oxygen you have, and then you arrest because you're now so anoxic you can't continue to maintain cardiac function. Totally different than VF. Those people, children pulled out of a swimming pool, they need breathing. They need mouth-to-mouth or some source of oxygen replenishment. But the witnessed adult does not. He has plenty, and in fact, we now have really convincing data that 15 minutes you can do just fine with nobody ever replenishing one single atom of oxygen. Now, eventually, you got to pay the piper, but it is not within the first few minutes of cardiac arrest. And yet, we had so concentrated on that piece that it became an impediment. So we simply said in 1990, well, what if? What if we changed it? And we even took the breathing part out. We based that on some animal data. This is not humans, and these pigs are not people. But this is pretty convincing. This is, in fact, return of spontaneous circulation. So VF model, fibrillated, and this is not compression rate, but actually compressions delivered within that minute. So if you stop to go breathe, you're a single rescuer by yourself, there's no compressions going on. So if you're pushing at 100 a minute, doesn't mean you got 100. Depends on how long you're off the chest. But if you deliver 80, the white circles were successfully resuscitated, the black were not. Something quite magical, at least for pigs, around 80 compressions per minute. This is some more pig work. This is from our lab over at the university. No small number, 170, 6 different projects, 6 different studies. We said, well, what if standard CPR, back in those days it was 15 compressions, 2 breaths, 15 compressions, 2 breaths, versus compression only, versus what we began by calling the Tucson model. In our community in the 2000 era, the 90s era, the standard approach was this. Somebody'd collapse, the witness would walk over, shake and shout, yep, they're in cardiac arrest. They'd stop, do the appropriate thing called 911, and then what? Wait. We've had an interest in our community for decades in cardiac arrest, and our firefighters are very good at it. The average time, nonetheless, from call to when they're at your side, 6.5 minutes. 6 minutes, 38 seconds, to be exact. During that period, they got nothing. And so we modeled that. That's the no BLS. That's just down on the ground until 6-7 minutes when help arrives. Look what we found. When we delivered 15 compressions, then 2 breaths, and the standards or guidelines have said for a long time 2 seconds per breath, so 4 seconds, then we started compressing again. 80 or 90% return of spontaneous circulation, and nearly that, 80% survived for 48 hours. Look what happened when we did not do any breathing whatsoever. 90% resuscitated, 80% survived 48 hours. Look what happens with the Tucson call and watch. You can get them back if you're aggressive, you get a pulse, but they don't survive. They're so damaged that in that 48 hours, they either die of cardiac or neurologic failure, typically. Well, we thought, well, that's kind of interesting. At least it's no worse. And if more people would do it, that's a winner. And then we had an eye-opening experience. This is Cardiff, Wales. This is the Cardiff Castle, over there in the United Kingdom. We had some good friends there who were very interested in what we were doing. And they decided they were going to train lay people in this technique. They actually had a TV program called 555, where they would go around the countryside and train people in CPR, and everybody wanted to be on it. It's kind of like reality TV in the US now. So they found 500 volunteers, half of which they trained in standard CPR, 15 and 2, half they trained in compression only. And then we videotaped right after they'd been taught. So before they could leave, we had them show us what they could do. Interestingly, then we invited them back, trained them again, refilmed them, but the funnest part was 6 months later. Unannounced, we went to their homes. Knocked on their door. If they opened the door, we threw Resusci Annie in on the floor before they could close it. That kind of reminded them who we were. And we said to them, now, in all seriousness, pretend that's your loved one. Would you show us one more time what you would do today? And then we filmed them. Well, some really interesting things came out. Some of it's simple. You could have predicted. If it's a simpler technique, people can do it more readily. They can remember. They get started sooner. That deer in the headlights kind of disappears and they go right to work. But what we learned about standard CPR we did not expect. And that was this. We have taught, I was the chair for the National ACLS Subcommittee in 2000. I wrote 2 seconds per breath, 2 breaths, 4 seconds, back on the chest. And we assumed people could do that. It was a lie. A bold-faced lie, not intentional, but nobody can do that. We had 250 people try. The average time it took them to leave the chest, go up to the head, tilt the head back, get a breath, put their mouth on that victim's mouth, blow it in, watch their chest rise, get off, watch their chest fall, get another breath, put their mouth back down, get a seal, blow it in, watch it come down, get back up, and remember the old days, you had to find the exact xiphoid process, 2-finger breaths, heaven forbid you forgot that, and start compressing. 16 seconds every time. If you're by yourself doing 100 compressions per minute, that means you get 9 seconds of circulation, 0.8 seconds per compression. And then you stop for 16 where you get no circulation. And frankly, lay people can't blow it in anyway. Then you get 9 seconds of blood flow and 16 more seconds of nothing. Turns out that 2/3 of the time with standard CPR at the 15 to 2 era, you're getting no help, none. It's amazing to me anybody survived. So what happens if you pause on the chest? The top one is, whoops, sorry. Okay. It's Boise 1, yeah. So what happens is when you're pushing, you create some pressure, some blood pressure, if you will, and that results in circulation. We actually measure something called coronary oh dear, I pressed. I need another strawberry Fanta, obviously. All right, it's the right one. It's the right one. So on the top is ideal CPR, 4 seconds per 2 breaths. If you had 2 people, you might be able to do that, but you certainly can't do it as an individual. And the columns are the blood pressure. In fact, the real important one is the difference between aortic diastolic, which is this pink, this being aortic, and right atrial diastolic, which is the bottom of the yellow. That gradient is what pushes blood across your myocardium and feeds it to allow it to defibrillate. And look what happens when you pause. It goes down. You have to rebuild it. See that? Well, then add to that, in fact, indeed, more than 4 seconds. In truth, if this is an artificial cardiac cycle, each one of these, only about 1/3 of the time is pressure maximum, and only 1/3 of the time are even pushing. 1/3 of 1/3 is 1/9. That means about 10% of the time you're getting reasonable flow. 90% of the time you're not. Well, okay, but what if you don't breathe? What happens? Well, it's all about oxygenation. It really is. And in fact, it turns out, as I spoke earlier, that the lung and the arterial bed are full. The key is to get it around. And this is perhaps a meaningful desaturation curve. For that individual who is choked, then passes out and has an arrest, this doesn't apply. Because again, they're already desaturated quite rapidly. But this curve is the curve with chest compression only during ventricular fibrillation. Notice that even at 10 minutes, you're 70 or 72% saturated. Now, there's probably nobody in here right now who's only 72%. It's not where you want to be, but it's enough. It's enough to keep your cells not only happy, but fairly healthy. Eventually, as we said, you got to stop and pay the price, and you got to ventilate and oxygenate. But it's not in the first 10 or even 15 minutes, to be honest. What's the price of interrupting to do attempted breathing? It's big, and it has to do again with the hemodynamics. This is an exaggerated but real example. Here, compressions start. This is that gradient between here and here, and you can see that for the whole 15 before it got maximum. You stop, and guess what? You got to start from ground zero. So you have to rebuild that each time. Well, that's nice. That's pressures. That's flow. But does it translate into outcome? This is experimental work still. This is our pig lab in the 90s. But we did compression only versus 15-2. Now we actually used realistic pauses, not 4 seconds, but 16 seconds. And now notice they're not equivalent. Compression only is dramatically better for outcome because you get better circulation. You get better oxygenation because you have a chance to move those atoms around to where they're needed. Yeah, but it's not 15-2 now, is it? It's 30-2. It's 30-2, to be honest, because some of this work got people's attention that you need more flow. But they didn't want to give up their 2 breaths. Well, we did that too, and it is a little better. But it's still not as good as compression only or continuous chest compression. So in 2003, when those firefighters knocked on our door, we said, you know what, we do have some ideas. Let's try them. And in November of that year, about 8 years ago, we began in Tucson a program to teach compression only to lay people. The firefighters jumped right in. They teach free courses. We teach free courses. And we've tried all kinds of things. This has been the fun part. So we have a monthly course at Duval Auditorium. About 150 people come each time. How many people live in Tucson?
1 million.
Yeah, 1 million. Draw the circle a little generous, but it's 1 million, isn't it? 150 at a time is going to take a long time to train them all. Okay? So this isn't the answer. Though we still do it because we think somebody gets trained, they have a chance of even just talking about it and frankly training somebody else. This is some of those people, and they're real people. I don't mean to make fun of this lady at all. But these aren't just high school kids or buff college kids. These are real people who are interested and are willing to try for their loved ones. We put some billboards up. Then UMC ran on hard times. We lost our billboards, but we had them up for a while. We had some interesting plaques at bus stops. They're usually prime spots for graffiti, but so far this one survived. This may be our most successful project. We put in the November, or maybe it was February, electric bill, 300,000 little bill stuffers. They went out to every family in Tucson that has to pay their electric bill. All it was the 3 steps. Shake and shout, get help, center of the chest, arms straight, elbows locked, compress it 100 times a minute, and if an AED is available, get it and use it. Many people looked at it, threw it away. But some people read it and then threw it away. My favorite story comes from TMC. I had a very good friend. Through a church assignment, I was asked to watch over him. He was 87. Bad heart disease, bad lung disease. Goes down one day in Safeway. Cardiac arrest, VF. A young 23-year-old man was nearby who had seen this bill stuffer, read it, and threw it away. Saw the guy go down, said, I can do that. He walked over, started pushing on his chest, no attempt to breathe, didn't stop. Paramedics arrived in their usual 6-7 minutes. He was doing such a good job. They said to him, literally, keep going while we set up. And they got all their gear out. Then they took over. They restored his pulse. They brought him to TMC. He woke up. His family came to town. Unfortunately, he got pneumonia 2 weeks later and died. But I still think that's a positive experience where his family at least had a chance to see him and perhaps, have more than a phone call that, oh, we found your dad dead. Now, ultimately, we'd like those people to survive, and I'll show you that we have a few. Well, we've gone not only from Tucson, but in 2005, the state of Arizona became very interested because we had seen success here. Bless the Tucson firefighters' hearts. They stuck their neck out. When nobody else was doing this, they said, we'll do it. Interestingly, we had to go talk to the city fathers' lawyers. What do you think they said? They actually didn't say that. They didn't say don't do it. They were very astute. They said, no, hold on. There are guidelines for this, are there not? Yeah, there are. And you want to deviate from them? I said, oh yeah, we do. But then they asked this, well, who wrote the guidelines? Oh, we had them. Because Gordon Navy wrote them. I wrote them. Art Sanders wrote them. We've been on the national scene in this field for 10, 20 years. And then they said, you wrote them, but you think this will be better than what you wrote then? We said, absolutely. You have our blessing. Go for it. And they never got in the way. If they had, it probably would have never happened. So that's one of my favorite aspects of the cooperation that we've seen. Well, then it went statewide in what's now called the SHARE program, or Save Hearts in Arizona. And I don't know how you feel politically. I really don't want to know. But Janet Napolitano, right or wrong, good or bad today, was instrumental in helping this go forward. She actually funded some personnel to help do this, and it has saved lives in our state in a big way. Here's the Phoenix firefighters. There's an interesting story. Phoenix is the big monkey gorilla no matter what we do in this state. And they didn't think they had to play. So Phoenix fire director said, we're not going to do it. We're happy with what we're doing. We're good already. Well, you know what? Mesa did it. Scottsdale did it. Gilbert did it. And when they had tripled their survival compared to Phoenix, guess what? Phoenix went back to their medical director of the firefighters and said, if we don't do this, we're going to quit. We're not going to be showed up by the suburbs. And when they got on board, big things happened. This is one of my favorites. So there's the gorilla for the Suns, and that's Gordon Navy. This has been Bob Rowe. He was the state EMS director. He's been instrumental in taking it beyond the animal lab into the real world, and we're in his debt. And that's, you recognize that guy? No, not Stoops, but who's our basketball guy? That's Sean Miller. He'd just gotten to town. He's very interested in that. Look at his face. And then there's this. So we've gone to schools. We trained 10,000 sixth graders, not with the idea that they'll be the ones, but to go home and train families. And then we got this nice thing.
About 1,000 people die every day due to unexplained sudden cardiac arrest. You can help save a life. It doesn't require performing mouth-to-mouth breathing. You will not hurt the cardiac arrest victim, and under Arizona law, you cannot be held liable for trying to help. Arizona's SHARE program teaches people of all ages with no formal medical education what they can do if they see someone collapse, unconscious, and unresponsive. Learn what you can do to save a life. Log on to azshare.gov today. Be a lifesaver, become SHARE aware.
If we had to buy that 30 seconds, we could have never afforded it. But bless Steve Nash's heart, he was willing to do that for free. And that has had an impact, maybe not so much in our community, but in Phoenix, where that was shown for a good 6 months. No question it influenced people to participate. Well, we've made a real effort, but it's little pieces here, little pieces there. Does it matter? Here is this is the incidence of bystander CPR in the last it's back a few years, but from 2005 to almost 2010. We started at 25%, and that's pretty average. That means 1 out of 4 will get some help, 3 out of 4 don't. And over that time, it rose to 35%, basically. A third, or 36% increase. We'd love it to be 100%. We'd love everybody to get it up here. But that's not reality. But interestingly is this curve. So with that 10% gain, it's all been people willing to do compression only. And you can see now in 2005, about 15% of those who got bystander, who did bystander, did compression only. Today, or in 2009, it was 80%. So this has really caught on. Gordon likes to say the public has made their mind up. And I agree with that. If they're going to do something, it's going to be compression only. It's not going to be full CPR. But again, so the incident's gone up a little. The proportion that's doing compression only has gone up a lot. But does it make it any different in outcome? These are data just published in JAMA a year ago. All from Arizona, including Tucson. All rhythm cardiac arrests in Arizona. So VF, non-VF, whatever it is. If you got no help, there's still a slight chance you could survive. It's not good, 5%. If the bystander attempts 30 to 2 CPR, no difference than if you got nothing. But if they do compression only, threefold improvement, 5% to 13, 15%. Yeah, wow. This is the best rhythm. These are where the survivors really come from. Witnessed VF. Here it is. Nobody helps you. Few people survive, 17%. If you get tempted 30 to 2, no difference. 19%, not statistically different. But if they give you compression only, 33% survive. Double survival in the best rhythm that you could be in for your cardiac arrest. Well, we're not the only place. This is a very large series out of Tokyo, 10,000 cardiac arrests. Compression only versus compression of mouth-to-mouth, 11% to basically 20%, doubled survival in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. This was Tom Ray from Seattle. This is dispatcher assisted. So you call up and they tell you what to do on the phone. If they tell you to do standard CPR, 11% survived of their VFs. If they tell you compression only, 12.5. Not overwhelming. A little better, but not statistically enough. This is a similar study in New England Journal, same issue, from Sweden, 7 to 8.5. But if you combine them and get adequate numbers, it becomes significant with a definite improvement in favor of just instructing them with compression only. That has become a class 1 recommendation. So all 911 dispatchers are offering to teach you CPR, but they're teaching compression only now. Well, how about the second part? So the lay people have a part, but so do the EMS providers. They're really interesting folks. They're very dedicated, but they don't do things perfect. We actually, with AED technology, could tell when the firefighters were pushing on the chest and when they weren't. They never go alone, so there's always multiple rescuers. There's at least 2, often 4. At your beds, kneeling at your side in your front room, 4 people, and more than 50% of the time, no compressions were being done in 2003. Why not? Because we told them to do other things, myself included. Check the pulse, check the EKG again, get an IV and put an endotracheal tube down. On and on and on. Recheck the patient. All of that came at a cost that we didn't realize until we actually got data. And when you ask them, well, when you do stop to put the tube down, how long? Oh, 10 seconds, never more. Not true. Get real data, and here's what you see. The longest period without compressions, 3 minutes. The average, a minute. This isn't 10 seconds. These are substantial interruptions that cost lives. So we changed what we asked them to do. Tucson has followed this since 2003, and many communities around the world now use the same kind of idea. When you arrive, one person immediately starts compressions. Here they arrive, excuse me. 200 we picked out of the air because we didn't want them watching their watch, but we wanted about 2 minutes worth. So if you're doing 100 compressions per minute, and you count off 200, it's about 2 minutes. Then, this is without anything else except shake and shout. If they don't respond, start pushing. After 200, you have to analyze the rhythm to see if it's shockable. If it is, single shock. No more 1, 2, 3 stacked, going from 200 to 360. Single shock, big volt, whatever you got in your machine, give it to them. And then, perhaps the most important part, don't recheck, don't feel for a pulse, don't look at the EKG, immediately start compressing. When you and I went through our last course a few years ago, clearly the most sinful act was thought to be pushing on somebody who didn't need it. Oh, don't ever do that. If their heart is beating and you push on their chest, oh, wrong. The most hurtful adverse act is withholding compressions when they need it. What if you do have a heartbeat and somebody pushes on your chest? Right. It just keeps beating. There's some data that says if you get it just right, that you might actually have enough electrical activity to fibrillate them. It's a dream. If you see one, let me know. I'd like to get it published. But I know for a fact, if you don't have a heartbeat and you're standing there and not pushing because you're not sure, it's bad. There's no circulation, and there's no delivery of oxygen, and there's no tomorrow, typically. And so that was the hardest thing for the paramedics to agree to, but we finally convinced them. Don't look, push, because we looked at 61 Tucson cases, consecutive VFs in the field. The first shock always terminated the VF, but never did it bring back a pulse. They always either go to asystole or EMD or something, but they don't perfuse. But if you perfuse them with post-shock asystole, guess what happens? They get their heartbeat back. But if you wait 30 seconds, it's too much. That insult is just perfectly timed to make their heart not respond, and you're done. I think of all the lives we've saved, probably the vast majority are from that arrow right there. And then we tell them this, look, if the guy opens his eyes and asks you to stop, stop. Okay? It's just not that hard. Okay. We ask them to do 3 cycles of this, so 200, 200, 200. If they're not back, fine. Revert back to standard ACLS. Go ahead and breathe for them, because frankly, they're not going to survive. Well, does it make any difference? Here's the data. Terry Valenzuela is the firefighter director, medical director here in town. This was the pre-era, 10%, very similar to what I showed you for decades. 10% survival for all VF cases in Tucson, from 97 to 99. 314 of 28 lived. We changed what we do with these first two steps. This doesn't even include aggressive post-resuscitation care. Went from 9% or 10, if you will, to 25, 2.5-fold. Now we deal with small gains in medicine. We're very happy if survival goes from 10% to 12% with thrombolytics. Or, oh, wow, how about primary angioplasty? Let's get it to 14%. This is 250%. Well, we got an update. Here's the original data through 06. Here's the data through April 10. In Tucson now, for all VFs, both witnessed and unwitnessed, but if you're still in VF when the paramedics arrive, nearly 40% survival to discharge in our community. Again, started at 10%. That's a 4-fold improvement, 400%. Maybe it's just Tucson. Here's those suburban communities that pushed Phoenix Fire. 900 cardiac arrests, not a small number. Prior, 2% survival for all comers, up to 5%. Long way to go, but 200% improvement. Here's VF in those two communities. 200 cases, 175, 5% to 18%, 3-fold improvement. Well, how about the state? You know, that's just suburbs of Phoenix. Here's the state that includes rural as well as urban sites. 2,400, 2,500 cases now, all comers. 4% to 9%, doubled. And VF, throughout the state of Arizona, 12% before, 28% after. That's pretty exciting. And it's not just us. This is from rural Wisconsin. Very similar algorithm with one exception. They wouldn't let their guys ventilate with positive pressure ever. So they could put oxygen on, either in a nasal cannula or a mask, but they weren't allowed to use an ambu bag or a ventilator. They did not want positive pressure, because it turns out if you're in a shock-like state, which CPR certainly is, low flow, positive pressure in your thorax is a bad thing. It decreases flow to your head and your heart. So they said, just don't do it. We know it takes you 20 minutes to get to the hospital. Fine, just put that oxygen on and leave them. That's what they did. This is an interesting story. 15% before, in their old way, 50%. This was so good, we couldn't get it published. We tried the New England Journal. Oh, no way. JACC, no way. JAMA, no way. We had to actually go to Joe Alpert, one of our colleagues who was the editor of the American Journal of Medicine. Said, Joe, you owe us a favor. Publish this. And he did. It's now one of the most cited articles in CPR literature. But it was thought to be too good to be true. Something is wrong. Somebody's lying. So we said, well, keep track of it. So 3 years worth of data now. Yeah, they were right. It didn't stay at 50%. It fell to 40. But look at that again. That's a 3-fold, 2.5-fold improvement over the long term. Kansas City, same thing. All rest, 8 to 14. VF, 22 to 44, 100% improvement. And what if you do both? What if your community is teaching people to do compression only and your paramedics follow a more aggressive approach concentrating on compressions? Well, these are the data. And in every case, it's doubled or tripled or doubled or tripled. These aren't small gains. These are tremendous gains. And here's what we've discovered in our own experience now with about 1,000 cases where we didn't tell the paramedics they couldn't ventilate once they were on their route. We'd ask them enough, and you know, you kind of get a feel that's all they're going to do. Push them one more step and they're going to back out. So we allowed them, and they chose for themselves. And you can see, so not randomized, but self-selected by the group that was treating. 2/3 of them provided bag valve mask ventilation, but 1/3 didn't. They just put that oxygen source on and shipped them. Here's the groups, again, not randomized, but pretty well matched. Witnessed about the same, bystander about the same, actually in favor of bag valve mask, and VF the same. But here's the actual, excuse me, let me go back. For all rhythms, if you did the breathing, 6% survival. If you did passive oxygen insufflation, doubled. Here's for witness VF, tripled. So there is something to this, we think, that positive pressure ventilation is not without its cost. Well, and here's that final data for our state. This is the control era before we did anything. This is the first paper we published in JAMA where positive pressure ventilation was allowed. Survival went up from 12 to 28. But when we actually did not allow it and used only oxygen insufflation, went up again now to 38%. And then the piece I didn't bring tonight, if you aggressively treat them once they get to the hospital, this is up to 56% throughout the state in centers that are doing that. Well, again, it's not for everyone. I can't leave you without that message. It's not for children. They need to be replenished because their arrests are always 90% driven by respiratory problems. And we've been criticized that if it's so good for VF, then you must be hurting the other group. But here's the actual data. Pre and post, not a big change, but in fact, the trend favors, even in non-VF, respiratory arrests for compression only. So I think the bumper sticker should say this. CPR saves lives, but cardiocerebral resuscitation saves more lives. But the battle's not over. I'm so glad you've showed that. Hold that card up for me one more time. Okay? So we had our CPR night. It was at the USC game. That was a guaranteed win, or we would have never taken that one. Anybody know who this is? That's Dr. Sanders. He'll step down in August, but he stepped up in a big way when the university needed him. But I actually put this in for this man. I don't know if you know him, but I have his permission. That's Bob Charles. He's an assistant district attorney. He was playing tennis at the racket club. A physician in our community had heard this talk. Once they decided he wasn't kidding and he was really down and out, he started compression-only CPR. They resuscitated him. They brought him to UMC. I took him immediately to the cath lab while he was being cooled. Cathed them, found they had actually substantial disease. Called the surgeon. Now that's an interesting discussion. Here's a man, bad disease, but comatose. We've moved on in our angioplasty work. We will do these people regardless of what their neuro is, because we know that there's a 90% chance if they survive, they'll be neurologically intact. But surgeons aren't quite there yet. Oh, I don't know. Geez, let them wake up. No, no. You got to take them now. We took him, we cooled him, we woke him up 24 hours later, warmed him up, and Bob Charles was walking the hallways within 2 days. He's back at work. He's one of our great champions that this saves lives and doesn't fill up nursing homes with those lives. These people go back to work. This is the young basketball team from one of the high schools who put all the plaques out. There they are. Before the game started, 14,000. There's the backside. People actually read it. Some of them even took them home. Here's that means 5 people didn't get theirs. Here's another one. Here's everybody holding them up, and while they hold up that 3, guess what they're looking at? 3 simple steps. Call, compress. What's the 3rd step on the back there? What, who's got one? What's the 3rd thing say? CC. What's the first C? Check. Call and compress. There we go. Yeah, okay. And actually, this is my son's favorite shot. Yeah. I don't know if you've had your personal audience with Wilbur or not, but he's a good guy. Yes?
Has your standard been adopted nationwide?
Yeah. So we've battled with American Heart, even though I'm actually the current counsel of the Cardiopulmonary Council, the chair. It's not been an easy battle. They have not wanted to give up the 2 breaths. They argue this, and I think it's foolishness, but they argue that there are some people who need it, agreed, and lay people can't tell I think they can tell who came out of a pool and who didn't. I think they can tell a difference between an adult and a child. But they're very worried about that. However, in 2008, they actually adopted compression only for bystanders with some caveats. And they still write it where if you're uncomfortable or you don't feel you've been adequately trained, then do compression only. The implication is it's on your shoulders, and that's wrong. I think if the lay public is willing to help, we need to take it off their shoulders and just say, do this. But so far, we haven't resolved that completely. However, I can tell you this, the rest of the world is convinced. In the last couple of years, I've been all over the Far East, all over South America, all over Europe, and they're on board. So the American Heart's kind of the last holdout. But they're coming. They're coming. Well, none of this work gets done alone, and I'd certainly like to acknowledge Gord Navy. This may be my mother's favorite part of it. We got our own little flag on Speedway for a short period, so I made sure I sent her this picture. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful pleasure. Yes?
You had those wonderful data pertaining to survival through hospital discharge, and you pointed out that many of these people, probably the majority, are performing well weeks, months,
Yes.
years later.
Yes.
Some of them are not. I
Yes.
know a couple who are not.
Okay.
And what percent are not okay?
So if you take the full program where you have active involvement from your lay public, a EMS system that's on board and providing good BLS and ACLS to start, you can't just do post-resuscitation care and win this battle. But then if you cool them and cath them and open their arteries up, the actual survival rate is now, and there's about 2,000 reported cases of this, 60%, it's not 100%, but 60% survive, and 90% of the survivors are neurologically intact. So 10% are not. The really good news is those 10% generally do not live years and years and years like Terry Shira in a nursing home, vegetative care. They're sick enough they die pretty quickly. Now, there's always an exception, but it's really very encouraging. It's almost bimodal. Either you do very well or you have enough damage you die. And actually, that's good news for us. The great fear is that, oh, you're just going to fill up the nursing homes. That is not true. All the data in the last decade have shown that's just not true.
But the people who need somebody to drive them around the rest of their life can't organize their affairs to get their income tax together?
They'd be a failure to me.
Okay.
That would be in the 10%.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes?
Are you giving out CPR cards?
We actually give a letter, but it's not obviously good enough for anybody who needs certification for their job. Because we're not battling the American Heart in that market. They have that. They want to continue that. Do we think it's important? No. So what we actually advertise on the radio and the TV is just come and learn how to save a life. But if you need a card, you better go talk to the Red Cross or the American Heart.
Do the paramedics routinely use airways?
Yeah. Yeah, they do. We won't allow them to intubate or put down a laryngeal airway until the third cycle. But they'll put an oral airway in just to get your tongue out of the way because, frankly, the compressions themselves move some air. And you can actually hear it. There's a billows effect that's undeniable. And it probably helps. If you've got a completely closed airway, you won't get that assistance. So yes, they just put down a quick oral airway and bingo, then they're back doing other things. I didn't talk about it, but one of the exciting features is there's a lot of controversy about drugs in CPR. Does epinephrine make a difference? I can tell you this, it makes a world of difference in the animal lab because they get it early. You can literally watch their pressure and it just goes dramatically up. And then you shock them, they all come back. It doesn't seem to work in people. Why? The average time in Tucson to receive epinephrine is 23 minutes from the time of arrival, not even from your collapse. They're busy doing other things. It took a long time to get an IV. Today, with intraosseous devices, and there's a screwdriver and there's a gun. It's simple. You find the tibial plateau, even a non-orthopedist like me can find it, and you go, boop, it's in. And it's just like a central line. You pull on it, it looks like venous blood. And you can inject everything, including epinephrine, within the first 2 minutes and have a dramatic effect. So we're actually very high on that, and we're looking at that study-wise right now. Yes?
In your animal studies, you said that positive pressure ventilation wasn't good. How did you ventilate your pigs?
We actually ventilate, we tried 2 different ways. You know, they have a long larynx. They're quite different than you and I. So a lot of times we just leave the tube in, and then we use an ambu bag. But we pull it a few times to do that too with snout bag. And then we actually, to be absolutely sure, we did a project where we put a tube in and we clamped it. So there was no air movement whatsoever. And frankly, even that had very little effect for the first 10 minutes. Eventually, again, you have to pay the price and ventilate it, but not right away. Yes?
Is there a role for early intervention with lowering their body
Yeah.
temperature?
So there's 2 randomized trials ongoing right now of in-the-field cooling where they give ice-cold saline. And some communities have already adopted that, some haven't. It's not really known whether it'll make a difference or not. But there are plenty who are simply putting a refrigerator on their ambulance and using 4 degrees centigrade. You can usually get in 1 liter to 1.5 liters before you arrive at wherever you're going. That drops the temperature by about 1 degree of centigrade. So if you started at 36, you might be 35. The goal with hypothermia is to get to 33. So you'd still have to continue it, but it may jumpstart it. And we don't know the answer. It's being looked at right now.
Where's that liter go?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because some of my work suggested that you really get stunning from your myocardium. You know, you look at these hearts after they've been resuscitated. You want me to stay here? And frankly, here it was yesterday, and right after resuscitation, it honestly looks just like that. The EFs are 20% or less. And I said, oh, don't give that guy 1.5 liters. It doesn't seem to matter. They're so vasodilated in this state that they handle that volume very readily. And they're not all coming in with pink frothy pulmonary edema. Well, I think there's dessert. So, thank you.